Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. For the next 4 episodes, my guests and I will be examining the path to open access, open science, and transformative agreements from the perspective of a publisher, Springer Nature. Actually, the word transformative is no joke. Making the shift to open access has had a major impact up and down the content supply chain, from research to production and editing, distribution technology, sales, and of course, libraries and end users. In the next 4 episodes, we'll be getting some valuable insight into how Springer Nature began its journey to support open access and open science, the important lessons learned, the milestones along the way, and how this mission is changing the way we interact with scholarly content in profound ways. Joining me for this discussion will be Caroline Nevison, Director of Commercial Transition to OA at Springer Nature, and Dr. Ritu Dand, Vice President Editorial, Nature Journals at Springer Nature. We kick off this series, which is sponsored by Springer Nature, with a primer on open. We'll provide some context around the concept of open and what that means for 2 important groups, researchers and publishers. Okay, Caroline and Dr. Dand, welcome to the program.
Hello, Bill. Lovely to meet you.
Likewise.
Hi, Bill.
Hi. So before we begin, why don't we just start with some introductions? And Dr. Dand, why don't we start with you?
My name's Ritu Dand, as you've already said. I've worked at Nature for 22 years now. I joined as a little editor, handled papers in cancer and signaling, and worked directly with the authors. And then I became the chief biological sciences editor. And for 14 years, I oversaw the process of peer review on Nature. And for the last 7 years, I've been the VP editorial for the Nature journals. And here I oversee editorial impact and strategy for all the Nature journals, as well as reviews, Nature, and Nature communications. In terms of why I'm here, open research has always been a part of my career. When I was an editor at Nature over 20 years ago, I was working with the authors to cajole and persuade them to deposit data in open repositories, as well as ensuring that reagents were being shared. And then as chief editor at Nature, my focus turned to reproducibility and the sharing of the methodology behind the experiments. And as VP, the main focus has been the rolling out of the open science strategy across all our journals. And this covers everything from data, protocols, opening up the peer review process, and of course this year, overseeing the Nature journals publish fully open access papers. That was a little bit long-winded, but I think that gives you the full picture of why I'm here today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Caroline, how about you?
Hi, Bill. Yeah, pleasure to join you on the program today. I'm not at the 22 years, but I have been with Springer Nature for 15 years this summer. I started at Palgrave Macmillan, which then merged into the Nature Publishing Group, and then on to the merger to create Springer Nature. I've always worked in library-facing commercial roles, and actually always sort of selling essentially our online subscriptions. And because in the last, several years, I've been focusing on Europe, and in particular Northwest Europe, there's been a lot going on in terms of the intersection between open access and subscription, traditional subscription deals. So that's where I've ended up, building up quite a bit of experience in open access. And so my current role was actually a new one just from the start of this year. Which is Director of Commercial Transition OA. And it's just really exciting to be able to look across Europe at what's happening with this transition and taking that forward to what's happening globally, and in particular, how each library and consortia is working with that.
Right. Excellent. Okay. So I think maybe some discussion on what open really means. I think our listenership is pretty familiar with, and they should be, with open access in general. But I think maybe taking a broader look at that and including open science with open access, and kind of talking about open from that broad perspective might be instructive. So, Dr. Dond, let's start with you. What does open research mean from your perspective? I mean, you're clearly coming at this from an editorial position, which means you kind of have a special investment in how authors are supported throughout this process, for example. So what are your thoughts on connecting open research with open access?
Thanks, Bill. Well, as I've already alluded to, the big milestone this year was for the Nature journals to publish open access. But publishing the paper open access doesn't make the research open. And I'm not sure everybody thinks about it this way. So, working in open science, as I started at the beginning, is something that I've always been doing. Unfortunately, not all scientists embrace the sharing of their research. Science is competitive, there are limited rewards in terms of the top jobs, promotions, receiving grants. Many scientists are engaging with industry, and more institutes now also have intellectual property rights. So, giving everything away before publication may threaten any one of these rewards. So, many scientists actually only share if they have to. In addition, sharing data actually requires a lot of expensive infrastructure to be built, maintained, and supported, and the funds for this have not been forthcoming. The journals work with the authors at the end of their publishing process. And at this point, we have tried to step up and support the community as much as possible. But the endeavor does require, open science requires investment and engagement by a much wider group. So, Springer Nature, and in particular the Nature portfolio, have over the years generated many resources to support open access and open research. I think of open science as having 5 pillars. And if I may, I'm going to briefly go over these 5 pillars with you. So we have preprints, peer review, data and code, protocols, and of course, publishing, open access. The Springer Nature journals have been developing and pushing at the boundaries with several of these initiatives for many years now. And I'm going to just quickly, briefly mention what I mean by each of those. So we have a collaboration with Research Square, who provide an option for all our authors to be able to submit a preprint to InReview, which facilitates the sharing of the research at the very earliest stage. We've worked to make the Nature Journal's peer review process more transparent. Open science is not just about the authors making the research open, it's about the publishers making what they do open. And it's because it's important that the research community can see how the research has been validated. So we have been publishing reviewer names, if they want to, on papers for many years. And at the moment, we have a trial on several journals where we are publishing reviewer reports. And we aim to roll this out as a wider initiative next year. As I said, scientists don't like to always share data. Often there is more than one paper that could be written from any data set, and authors want to ensure that given all the work that has gone into generating that data, they get maximum value for it. We have many initiatives in play that aim to make data and code open. So we publish data declarations on all our papers. These tell you where the data can be found and whether the data are open. We also offer advice on suitable repositories for the deposition of data, and we will mandate data deposition where this is a community norm. We've also launched another journal called Scientific Data, which is an open access journal which curates large data sets or helps the authors to curate the large data sets. And we actually publish descriptors which allow the data to be properly interrogated and reproduced. We also have a collaboration with CodeOcean, who offer authors a platform for deposition and operation of code through peer review. And at publication, the code is open to all our researchers. The fourth pillar, protocols. These are the detailed recipes for how to do an experiment. They contain all the tips and the don'ts spelled out for the researchers. And it may come as a surprise, while these are so important to be able to reproduce the research, these detailed protocols are often not published with a paper. And usually you get this overview of the methodology used, and researchers are expected to work from there. But the truth is that a new methodology is very difficult to utilize for the first time. Researchers will often hunt out authors with detailed protocols, go to their labs, watch them do it to get access to this information. We have launched Protocol Exchange, which is a preprint server for protocols. And we encourage all our authors to deposit protocols that are associated with their work. And in some cases, we mandate this. We've also generated a reporting checklist which checks that acceptance and ensures that key elements of the experimental design and statistical analysis are always presented with each paper. This is particularly important for ensuring results can be reproduced. And finally, as I've already alluded to, the Nature journals have now an open access publishing option, and that has been like the final milestone in this sort of pursuit for open science.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Caroline, as you oversee the transition process, what's your perspective like? Maybe perhaps use Biomed Central as a jumping off point. I think at that point, OA was about volume, right? How did the models evolve from there? And how has your role evolved since you started directing these transitions?
Sure, yeah, Bill. Yeah, I guess it's fair to say my focus is on open access. I do have some familiarity with all the open science aspects that Ritu talks about that are so important to our organization. But because my focus has always been on the library community and I guess acquisitions, it's kind of kept pace with that. You refer to BMC, Biomed Central. Of course, yeah, they were a pioneer and still are a pioneer of open access publishing. They established in 1999. Now the fully open access portfolio does have over 500 journals, but I wouldn't say it's been all about volume.
Okay.
BMC have been innovators in so many ways. Ritu mentioned peer review. They were one of the first publishers to open up peer review. They did that right from the start in 99. And very early on, they knew how important it was to promote and standardize data sharing policies, for example. So, yeah, I think the open access volume is just one strand of that. Elsewhere in what's now the full Springer Nature portfolio, Nature Communications was of course somewhat of a game changer. It began as a hybrid journal, but as both the open access content and the subscription content growth far sort of outstripped expectations, I do recall some kind of complex library conversations at the time. To say the least, we were trying to manage the pricing, the sustainability of this model. And, it was a mega journal that was hard to do.
Right.
I guess, once that decision was made, that the decision to convert it to a fully open access journal made complete sense. But I think it's fair to say the hybrid or the transformative journal model is one that is fundamental across much of our portfolio in this transition. And that's where I focus a lot of my own energies. It is proving highly effective. And usually it would be the hybrid portfolio that we're talking about when we talk about the transition, because that's the part that is seeing sort of the most transformation. So yeah, I could talk about that portfolio a little bit more and what the transition has meant so far. So we have over 2,000 hybrid journals. This list does continue to grow. We do publish society journals, and some of them have been moving more gradually onto the model. For our own journals, it's somewhat easier to make that decision. I'd say that these journals are really essential to the transition because they allow us still to offer unrestricted publishing venues to authors, whether they're in a country or institution that's ready and able to support Gold Open Access. And so they're able to convert their publishing from subscription to open access rapidly, or whether they're in a country that or institution that still needs to be able to select the subscription publishing option for the time being. We, having had these hybrid journals as a key part of the Springer portfolio, we have been able to offer transformative agreements. And these transformative agreements started in 2015. Whereas on the Nature Research portfolio, it's a much newer proposition. The journals became hybrid or transformative this year. And so our transformative agreements there are only just beginning now with our first pilot agreement with Max Planck Digital Library in Germany that began this year. So that's where, there's some difference in the portfolios where they're at on their journeys. For myself, I mentioned at the start, I've spent much of the last few years working on transformative agreements in countries that were sort of at the forefront. UK, Sweden, Netherlands were some of our earliest agreements there. Mm-hmm. Whereas now I'm able to look at this from a broader global perspective. It's extremely exciting. Some countries are at the start of the journey. Others have had open access policies, transformative agreements established for many, many years. So, there's a lot of variety in the conversation. And it is challenging to meet the different needs, to keep on top of the changing policy landscape. But it's a really enjoyable transition to be working on too.
Excellent. Perfect. You just heard from Caroline Nevison, Director of Commercial Transition to OA at Springer Nature, and Dr. Ritu Dand, Vice President, Editorial, Nature Journals at Springer Nature. Springer Nature is the sponsor of this 4-part series of the Authority File. Join us next week when we continue our conversation and do a deep dive into transformative agreements, how they started, and their practicality and benefits.
For those that want to publish open access, it's not always straightforward. It's not always easy. And this is where transformative agreements can take much of the pain of open access publishing away from the authors. Not all authors are aware of how to access funds for publishing. Usually there's a lot of red tape involved in releasing those funds, either from a funding body or an institute. And for many authors, they don't publish often enough for this to become something that they're very familiar with.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.